he said his brother was supposed to come into town, but then he ended up getting the flu. Brother Keith did. So y'all pray for him. I don't know if he's going to be here this morning at all or not. His intentions have been to come on in, but anyway, I think a lot of people's got the flu right now. We're going to be in Exodus 3. So I've been started at the beginning of the year reading through the Bible, and so I'm in Joshua right now. And so when I was reading in Joshua this past week, the Lord began to, I come across this thing, and we're going to go to Joshua when we leave Exodus, and I entitled it The Holy Moment. And so I didn't know I was going to get to teach. I thought, well, maybe this will be a message, and I'll get to actually preach it, but it's going to be a Sunday school lesson. And I'll try to teach instead of preach. I'm not sure I'm a great teacher, but I'll try to teach. So Exodus 3, 1 through 5. And let's just read real quick, and then we'll break it down. Well, actually, let me give a little backstory before we read on Moses, because I like to catch us up where we're at. Not that we don't know the life of Moses, but one thing I see about in Moses' life is that the hand of God on his life, like from a baby on, when he was born, Pharaoh had sent out this decree to all the Hebrew, the Israelites. They were living in Egyptian bondage at the time. And so when Moses was born, Pharaoh had sent out this decree saying that all the male children were to be born, and the Hebrew midwives were to kill them. If they came out and they were a boy, then they were to kill them. If they were a girl, they could keep them. And so, but them being, God-fearing women, they was like, we can't do this. And so they had been ignoring that order. And then when Pharaoh found out, he said, well, we're going to take all the male children that has been born, and he said, we're going to throw them all in the river. And of course, we know Moses' mom had hid him for 3 months, and then when she couldn't no longer hide him anymore, then, she built this somewhat of a basket, for him to go in that would float down the river. And one thing I find interesting with Moses' life is the very thing that was meant to kill him was the thing that saved him. The river was meant to kill him and take his life, but yet that was the thing that ended up saving him, because Pharaoh's daughter found him. And all of this was just ordained by God. And you could just see the hand of God on Moses' life throughout this. That was his saving grace. And it's like that in our lives often. The things that were meant to take us out of here was the things that God used for his glory and for our benefit. And he'll take even the bad things and use them for his glory if we'll let it. And so I see that with Moses' life, and he was, no doubt, his mom, she got to be the one that would nurse him and raise him the first part of his life. And then one day she had to take him to the palace and turn him over. And can you imagine as a mom? I can't imagine. That reminds me a lot of Samuel and Eli and Hannah, and how she had prayed for him and how she had to go and turn him in, and to be raised by somebody else. But I imagine that was a little easier even for her, knowing that at least he'd be raised in the house of God. But Moses' mom didn't have that, like he was fixing to be raised in something that they didn't even believe in, all these Egyptian things that were going on, and their worship that was going on. And so you had to think that she probably went home and began to pray, God, let it be enough. What I've raised him in, what I've taught him, Lord, let it be enough. Bring it back to him that he knows that he's not an Egyptian, that he's not in that kind of idol worship that they was in, and those rituals. But let it be enough that he was raised in the things of God. And so we know that God began to bring that back at some point in time, and that Moses obviously knew who his mother was. He had a relationship with his siblings because Aaron was his brother, and we see that come back into play as God led him to be the help Moses lead the children of Israel. And so we know God had all this ordained, but Moses rose up and he ended up killing one of the Egyptians that was hurting one of his people, one of the Hebrews. And so Moses, when he found out they had saw him, he thought, I'm going to die. I'm not one of these people. And so he fled for his life. And so up until this point, Moses has been, he's married. He's keeping the flock of his of his father-in-law. And he is just somewhere hanging out on the backside of the desert. So in Exodus 3, that catches us up on Moses' life. Exodus 3, 1 through 5 says, Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord God saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And God said, Draw not near hither, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. And so this is what we're going to be talking about, is the holy moment. You know, in Moses' life, God was leading him to do something much bigger than what he was. He was leading him to take on this great and mighty things that if we were to read forward, that we would find out that God was calling Moses to be able to lead the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage that they had been in all of Moses' life, you know, and that he was going to be the one that he was going to do it. And God was not asking Moses to get an army together and go overtake Pharaoh. That would have been a little easier, you know, but he wasn't asking him to take a sword in his hand and go fight, you know. He was telling him, in this holy moment, you're going to take the word of the Lord and you're going to go do what I called you to do. And so it's in those holy moments like that, those moments with God, that completely reshape and redefine our entire life. This completely changed the course of Moses' whole entire life. He would no longer be tending the sheep, his father-in-law's sheep anymore, that he had been doing for some time. You know, he would be uprooting his family, going back to a palace that he fled from, having to face his fears of, when I go back, what if they recognize me and kill me? You know, when I go back, I mean, you got to think he had to have like all of these questions in his mind, and probably this fear in his mind, but he was able to overcome those because of this holy moment that he had with God. This moment with God that instilled this boldness in him, that he knew the voice of God, that he saw the power of God. And some of the things that caught my attention the most in this was that, one, God knew right where Moses was at, because he knows where all of us are at. God knew right where Moses was at. And there again, we see that come into play. The very thing that Moses was doing, tending flock on the backside of the desert, in the wilderness, close to the mountain of Horeb, was the very thing God was going to lead him to do, except with people, you know. So Moses had been in preparation for some time of this. You know, he had been in preparation for some time of, you know, you're going to be leading people through the wilderness. You need to know how to live in the desert. You need to know how to survive in the desert. You need to know how to keep other things in the desert. You need to know how to lead them out of these hard places in this tough time, you know. And sheep are not, I can imagine, because we've got goats, you know, that they probably easily get themselves in trouble. Our goats do. They'll get themselves in a tight place and they'll start hollering, you know. And if somebody's not there to lead them, they're easily led, but they have to be led. If somebody's not there to lead them, then they're always getting themselves in trouble. And that's exactly what Moses was fixing to come encounter with the, you know, some 3 million children of Israel that God was going to entrust with him to lead out. If you don't lead these people, they're going to get themselves into trouble. You know, that's who they are. We know when the minute, you know, Moses left to go get the 10 Commandments, what did? They got themselves in trouble and built an idol. You know, they were people that they needed to be led by somebody, you know. And so we see all this come into play. So God had definitely been prepping Moses for what he was calling him to do. And the other thing that I noticed in this that caught my attention was the power of God in the bush that was burning but not consumed. Now, I've never been in the desert. It did not seem to surprise Moses that the bush was burning. I know things are dry there. Maybe it's not unusual to go by and there be something on fire and it just kind of burn out. I don't know. But that didn't seem to catch Moses' attention as much as it was that it was burning but it was not being burned up, you know. And that began to catch Moses' attention. And so when verse 4, it says, and when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside, God called to him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here am I. You know, when the Lord saw that he had Moses' attention, when he saw that he had him in a position, in a place, that Moses turned around and thought, what is going on? That's strange. You know, what is that? When God is trying to get our attention, it's important that we respond. So he got Moses' attention, and Moses responded with, here am I. Here am I, you know. And so as the Lord began to call Moses out of this burning bush, and Moses recognized the voice of God. And so here Moses is saying, he said, here am I. And the Lord begins to tell him, don't come near, just take your shoes off, because you're in a holy moment. You know, you're in this holy place. So Moses had happened upon this holy place that he didn't even know was going to happen. You know, just tending to his flock. And that's how it is a lot of times with us when God begins to call us, and that the Lord calls us when we least expect it. You know, when the Lord begins to ask us to do things for him and begins to speak to us, sometimes it's when we least expect it. Other times we create that moment. And in a way, that's exactly what Moses had done. He had created a moment with God that he didn't even know he was creating. But the few things we can learn from Moses is that when God's trying to get our attention, one, to pay attention. And two, when God begins to call us to respond. You know, and that's the same way as we go forward into today's services. That's the same thing God expects out of us today, that he has our attention today as the message is being brought forth, as the worship is going on, as the teachings are going on in Sunday school, that God has our attention. And once he has our attention, that when he begins to speak to us and deal with our hearts, that we respond to him. And it's those things that create a holy moment with God. It's those things that as God comes down and he begins to respond to us responding to him, that God begins to answer. You know, and as God begins to answer, then we begin to have holy moments with God all throughout the sanctuary, and it begins to spread. But it takes the people of God creating those moments with God that we don't ignore it, you know, that when God moves, that we don't just sit there. When God moves, that we don't just ignore it and say, well, I'm tired today. That when God is moving and that we are responding to the call of God, that we're saying, here am I, Lord, send me. Here am I, you know. If somebody is at the altar and you feel led to go pray for them, that I get up and that I go pray for them. You're messing with my microphone, aren't you? That I get up and that I go pray for them, you know. If I have a word for somebody, that I get up and that I respond to that, you know. If I feel led to do these things, that I get up and that I respond to the call of God, to what he's asking me to do. Because it's in those moments that we begin to stand on holy ground. Because it's in those moments that we're standing on something much bigger than what we are. Much bigger than what we can accomplish in our own selves. Much bigger than what we could do in our own selves. Okay. So God was calling Moses, and Moses was responding to the call of God. And God was telling him, he said, you're in a holy moment here. This won't be Moses' first encounter with God. It won't be his first holy moment with God, but it was what was needed. You know, Moses would not have had the boldness to go forward. Moses would not have the boldness to go forward in the things that God was calling him to do if he didn't have this moment first. And God knew that. God knew that, you know, he needed an encounter with him that would change his life, that would reshape his life, that Moses needed to understand that I've always been with you. From a child on, I've always had my hand upon you, because I've called you to much greater things than what you are and than what you could do. And that he had defined all of these moments for Moses' life. And that, you know, even though God was calling him to somewhat go alone in his own self, you know, but that God was going to be with him, you know. And God oftentimes calls us to things like that. I know in my own life, and I'm sure each one of us can think of times in our life that had it not been for God and God's hand upon our life, how things could have turned out so much different. You know, I was thinking about this because I grew up with my dad and my grandfather farming. And so when I was little, I followed in their footsteps everywhere, everywhere they went. Oh, I love the farm. Maybe that's why I live on the farm now. And, you know, I have animals, and, you know, it gets the time of year to start planting crops and to start harvesting. And, you know, if I had money and all, I'd probably be doing that myself because I love it. I grew up doing it. You know, I grew up riding a tractor or a corn sheller, and we grew up, I mean, being, you know, 10, 11 o'clock at night still bringing in the harvest, you know, or being out there and planting peanuts, you know, and just the fresh tilled up ground. And, you know, I remember walking through there, and we'd have peanuts and had turned them over, and Pa would walk through there, and he pick some fresh peanuts and give me one to eat. They weren't really good fresh, you know, but for some reason we had to try them. So I like them boiled or something, you know. And I remember one night, me and Dad we were on the corn chiller, and we were harvesting the corn, and it had rained really, really bad the night before, and it was dark. We were up on, he was plowing along, or he was bringing in the harvest along the side of the terrace there. And like I said, it was dark. We couldn't see. Our hamper behind us was full of corn, you know, and it held like 1,000 pounds or so, you know. So it's full of corn, and he was just trying to get this last terrace in so that we can stop for the night. And it had, what? Oh, sorry. I thought you were trying to get my attention. But so we're getting in the harvest. We're shelling corn on this top side of this terrace, and we didn't know that from the rain the night before, it had washed out a part of the terrace out from under us. And so, like I say, the hamper behind us is full of corn. And if you know about a corn sheller, they're very top heavy anyway. And then you get your hamper full behind you, they're really top heavy then. And so we're plowing along, and here that washed out beneath us came, and the corn sheller, the back tire fell off in it. And all of a sudden, this thing goes like this. And I remember as a kid being like, what's going on? You know, it scared me so bad. And because there's nothing beneath us, then it's rocking back and forth. And Dad looked at me, and he said, be very still. And I was thinking, I'm afraid to breathe right now. You know, like, it scared me so bad. And my grandfather had come to get us, and he was at the other end, and he saw it happen. He come out there, and, you know, Dad, he was pretty quick on his feet, you know, and so he thought, well, if I put my headers down and really dig them into the ground, they'll give us some stability. And so when he did that, it pulled us back up, and we quit rocking finally. And so when my grandfather came, he was like, first thing he said, I'm going to try to work us out of here. He said, but you get her down first. You know, he's so worried about my safety. And, you know, I look back on that, and as a little kid, I didn't think a whole lot about it. Things like that happen on the farm quite often, you know. Like, I was driving the corn sheller by the time I was 5 years old, you know. Like, I knew how to drive it, and something had happened one night. Daddy had to work on the engine behind me, and the only way to keep it running was him to, you know, be pouring gas into it, and I had to drive it back to the barn that was some like 2 miles away. You know, like, first time I ever drove that, I told Alex, he told me one time we were dating, he needed me to pull a trailer behind the truck, and he said, you got this? I said, I've been driving heavy equipment since I was 5. There ain't nothing I can't drive. But, you know, things like that happen. I didn't think a lot about it then. But then when you look back on your life, you know, and I thought, well, had it not been for the hand of God that night, had we, you know, tipped over that night, then we probably both would have been dead. You know, that's quite a long way to fall, and it's nothing but glass around you. You're not strapped in. There's no airbags, you know, and had that thing tipped over with me and Dad that night, there was a good chance we might not have survived it, you know. And so you just look through different things in your life that has happened, that you have stories, and you can see the hand of God on each one of our lives, and that God is calling us to bigger things. We wouldn't still be here if he wasn't, you know, that God has us in mind when he is calling us to bigger things. There's a purpose and there's a plan for our life. There's things that he's wanting us to do. And it's in those moments with God, in these created holy moments with God, that we find those things, that we find the voice of God. I remember when I first started wanting to hear the voice of God, that I'd pray for a little bit, then I'd just sit in silence. Be like, all right, Lord, speak to me, you know, and I just wait for the Lord, wait to hear his voice. And I remember when I would first start hearing the voice of God, that it seemed like my mind would get so jumbled with everything else. Like I'd hear his voice for a split second, and then it seemed like it went away. And like all these other thoughts would start clouding my mind, you know, and in my mind, I was like in search for the voice of God. You know, in my mind, I was trying to clear through all those thoughts and all those voices, you know, and I was just trying to find that voice of God again, you know, because I knew the voice of God and I longed to hear the voice of God. And so these holy moments with God, they carry us really far. These holy moments with God, as we're in search for the voice of God, we would find that throughout Moses' life, that this was the starting point of a relationship with God. You know, this holy moment was the starting point of Moses' life, changing forever, that God was entrusting him to do something that was so much bigger than who he was or than what he could do. And so as God began to call Moses out, Moses answered the right way, saying, "Here am I, Lord." And the Lord began to respond to that, began to call Moses into doing something that was much bigger for him. It's in this moment in the desert, as God got Moses' attention with the burning bush, and Moses turned his attention towards God, that Moses responded to God's call and has created this holy moment that will forever shape his life. So if we turn over to Joshua chapter 5, we're going to read 13 through 15. I never pulled this together. I know I have read this many times before because I already had it highlighted in my Bible. And for some reason, it never really caught my attention until I was reading it this week in my Bible reading. And isn't that amazing how you can read the Bible, read the same story, and you never draw the correlation between each other, and you never see it until God begins to reveal it to you. And so God had raised Joshua up to begin to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. We know God used Moses in a mighty way, but Moses wasn't without failures. He had failed God, and we understand that. We're all human. We all fail God. So he had failed God, and God said, you know, for this, you're not going to go into the promised land. You're not going to be able to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, but I'll show you the promised land. You'll be able to see it. And so he was raising Joshua up, and we see Joshua come into play with Moses. He was one of the 12 spies that got sent in to the promised land to see, you know, if it was like everybody said, and him and Caleb was the only two that came back with a good report. Everybody else was like, we can't do this. There's giants in the land. We might as well go back to Egypt, you know, and they were the only two that said, we are going to do it. We can do this because God's already said it's ours. So Joshua was already displaying leadership and a boldness inside of him. We find out that Joshua was also the one that when the children of Israel have failed God and there was sin in the camp, that Moses took, it says the tabernacle, but it was the tabernacle congregation, but it was actually his tent because they had yet to build the tabernacle yet. But he took his tent outside the camp and staked it outside the camp. And he began to seek God. And as the presence of God came down, we find that Joshua was one of the ones he was the only one that followed Moses out there and followed him to his tent. And even though he could not go into his tent, he just wanted to be near the presence of God. He just wanted to be close. So it said that he stayed at the door of the tent because he just longed to be close to God. He longed to be close to the presence of God. So we see Joshua was already having this hunger inside of him. He was already displaying these things, this boldness and this leadership that God was going to use him. him. And so he was the man of God that God began to raise up. And so when Moses died, Joshua took Moses' place into leading the children of Israel actually into their promised land. If you read the few verses before this, you find that the manna ceases and that all these provisions of God begin to dry up, you know. Why was God allowing this to happen? Because they were getting ready to step into the land that flowed with milk and honey. They was no longer going to need that. God had already made new provisions for them and new things for them. And so they were about to step into that and about to step into the things of God that God had promised them. And so Joshua steps into a holy moment here with the Lord that he didn't see coming. In Joshua 5:13, it says, "And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said, Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? And he said, No, but as the captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said to him, What says my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose your shoes from off your foot, for the place whereon you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. So I had never really seen this before, like I said, even though I know I've read it because I have it highlighted in my Bible. Obviously, at one point in time, it caught my attention. But I don't know that I ever drew the correlation between Moses and his holy moment and between Joshua and his holy moment. That both of these, that, you know, Joshua was leading the children of Israel into their promised land, but they had yet to have to go in and take anything. But the very next city that they, in fact, chapter 6 is entitled Jericho. The very next city that they were fixing to have to take would be Jericho. And God was also going to lead Joshua to go in somewhat an unconventional way, just like he had led Moses to go into Egypt. It's somewhat even though he had the army around him, he said, but you're not going to go in and you're not going to fight for this one. You're not going to overtake it like that. He said, you're going to go in and you're going to march around the city. And he said, you're going to obey the voice of the Lord. You're going to be quiet until the seventh day. And on the seventh day, then you are to shout, and I'll bring down the walls of the city. So, you know, God was asking in obedience to come out of Joshua, and he was asking him to do something that was only by the power of God that it could happen. You know, just like with Moses going into Pharaoh and having to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he was like, so I'm just going to go in and say, let my people go. And the Lord said, that's exactly what you're going to do, and I'm going to do the rest. You know, that you're to be obedient in this holy moment that I'm telling you what to do and that I've created for you. You're simply to respond and be obedient to the word of the Lord. That I'm going to ask you to do something that is far greater than what you are, or than what what you can do is far past what your ability is, but it is not greater than what God is and what God can be in us and through us. It's the power of God that rests on the inside of us. And so he had asked Moses to go in and do this, and we know that the Lord backed Moses up with all these plagues and eventually got Pharaoh to the point that he said, just go. Just go. Take it all and leave and get out of here. And you know, but ahead of that was going to be a Red Sea experience that Moses didn't know was coming, you know, but it was going to take the power of God and the voice of God leading Moses, and that holy moment was just the start for him. And just like with Joshua, the holy moment was just the start for him. That the Lord had sent an angel that was the captain of the Lord of hosts, that was the captain of the army of angels with him. And he would begin to tell him, he said, loose your shoes off your feet, for this place is holy ground. You're having this holy moment, just like Moses had this holy moment, because I'm going to ask you to go in and do something that is beyond your power. It's beyond your mind. And if you'll just obey the voice of the Lord, if you'll just go with what God is telling you to do, God will back it up. And so that's what he was telling him to do. And we know they would go in and they would conquer Jericho, and they would just go forward and they conquer the next city and the next city and the next city. And God would begin to just turn all of these cities into their hands, because this was ordained by God. But first, Joshua had to have a holy moment with God. And just like Moses, he recognized that this was unusual. There's a man standing with a sword drawn, and he's telling me he's the captain of the Lord of hosts. And he begins to Joshua begins to respond. He says, what does my Lord say unto his servant? It's kind of the same response Moses had, was, here am I. You know, in other words, he was saying, what does the Lord want me to do? I'm listening. What does he want me to do? And so he begins to tell him that this ground you're standing on is holy. Loose your shoes from off your feet. And so here, as Joshua goes forward into the things of God, he would have many of those moments that were defining moments that would reshape his life just like it did with Moses. You know, he would go forward and he would begin to take over Jericho. Jericho was going to be a challenge for him, because if he listened to the voice of God, then they were going to fight a different way. It wasn't going to be how they thought it was going to go down. It wasn't going to be how they had prepared themselves. You know, and oftentimes with God, that's exactly how it is. It's not how we think it's going to go down. You know, it's not how we have planned in our mind. You know, when we're going through a trial and a hard place, most of us try to figure it out on our own. I do. I'm guilty of it really bad. You know, I'll take it to the Lord in prayer, but I've already got 15 other ways that I think it's going to work out. You know, well, Lord, if this would just come in, if that would just come in, if this one would just do this, if that would just do that, you know, then I've already got it worked out of how it's going to work out, you know. But the Lord is wanting us to just get along with him and have these holy moments with him, that we hear the voice of God and that we respond to the voice of God and what he's telling us to do, and that in moving forward that we obey the voice of God. With both of these, with Moses and with Joshua, it was going to take them knowing the voice of God and obeying the voice of God to be able to do what God was calling them to do, to be able to fully step into this thing that God was calling them to. If they didn't do that, then they were going to be in trouble. It was impossible for them to do on their own. They couldn't, and Moses couldn't part the Red Sea if it wasn't for the voice of God. If it weren't for him listening to God and following every little step that he told him to do. You know, Joshua, the same way, going into Jericho, he couldn't conquer Jericho on his own. They might have been bigger than what Jericho was. I don't know. They could have went in and fought for it, but they would have failed even if they were bigger, because that's not what God told him to do. God told him to go in and to march around the city, and to do that 6 times, and on the 7th time to raise up a shout and that the walls would fall down. It was all dependent on them hearing the voice of God and them obeying the voice of God. And so as we go forward into, I don't even know what time it is. Oh, I'm doing good. As we go forward into the things of God that God is calling us to, oftentimes we have these holy moments. I've had several of these holy moments throughout my Christian walk with the Lord, as God, you know, comes down a lot of times when we least expect it, and with his presence, and God begins to speak to us. And when God is speaking to us, it's important that we do just like Moses did and just what Joshua did. And they're holy moments that when God gets our attention, that we respond. That we respond to what he is calling us to do, and that we reverence the moment that we're in with God. That not everybody gets to experience this. Not everybody gets to be the one that the Lord calls and says, hey, I'm going to use you today. Hey, I'm going to use you today. Hey, I'm going to use you today. I want you to go do this thing for me. I want you to go say this thing for me. I want you to be the one that does this. You know, in everything that we do with God, that if we'll just be obedient over even the little things, you know, it starts with even the little things, that we're obedient to the voice of God and what he is telling us to do. And imagine what God can do on the grander scale. You know, imagine what he can do in the big things in our life. But he won't trust us in the big things if we can't handle the small things first. God always starts us off with some smaller things. You know, he did in Moses' and Joshua's life. They didn't just happen upon being a leader of the children of Israel. You know, God had them in preparation for many years. He had Moses in preparation for many years. He had his hand upon him. The same with Joshua. But because of their obedience, because they could handle the little things, because they trusted God and they walked with God, then God elevated them to many things that was much greater than who they were. And God longs to do the same thing through us. He longs to do the same thing through our church. You know, we may look around this morning And there may only be a few of us here, and we may think, well, what can we do? But what can we not do? What can we not do? Sometimes we just have to change our thinking. Why not us? Why not me? Why can't God use me this morning? Why can't God use you this morning? If it's something in my life that is hindering that, then I need to take care of that. We pray all the time on the way to church. We always pray before we get to church as a family, and pray, for God to use us in a great way. And I always pray, God, remove the hindrances. If there's something in my life, then show that to me so I could take care of it, because I don't want to be a hindrance. I don't want to be a hindrance to the service, and I don't want to be a hindrance to God being able to use me. If it's something that somebody's going to walk in and they're going to have a hindering spirit on them, well, I'll go ahead and start binding that in the name of Jesus before we ever even get here this morning, that we bind every hindering spirit that would dare to stand against God and the things he wants to do in this service. And then we listen for the voice of God and what God is saying, that we've prepared ourselves. And when we prepare ourselves in the little things and we begin to get ready for the holy moment that we're going to have with God, then we come in with an expectation in our heart. We come in with an expectation in our soul and in our mind that God's going to do something big this morning. I've prepared myself. I've made myself ready. I've done what God has asked me to do, and that's my mindset going forward, that I'm going to listen for the voice of God this morning. I'm going to hear the voice of God, and when I do, I'm going to respond to it. I'm going to respond to what he's telling me to do and what he's calling me to do, that we have these holy moments with God, just as Moses and Joshua did, and that we learn to listen to the voice of God. If it had not been for the Lord leading them out of the wilderness into their promised land, it was with the same holy moment that he led them out of Egypt with. It was the same holy moment that he was leading Joshua into Jericho with. All of it was in deliverance for them. All of it, every part of it, God led them into a deliverance. He was leading them out of what they were into greater things in God. And that's what God longs to do for us. He wants to lead us into greater things than what we're walking in. Wants to lead us into our deliverance so that we're a people that gets to walk in freedom. So we're a people that don't walk around bound down with the things of the world that, and that's not just sin. A lot of times we accumulate that to sin, but that's not just sin in our lives. It is anything that would hinder us. It's anything that would hinder us from hearing the voice of God, from being able to respond to the voice of God, to being able to do what God is calling us to do. It could be anything that we put before God, and that's as a sin unto us. So I guess it all is sin. If we're putting it before God, then it's those things. But when God is speaking to us and he's calling our attention, that we respond to it, that we look to God, that, how would, I can't talk this morning. How different would it be if Moses had not responded to God? How different would it be if he had not turned around and looked at the bush? That was the first thing. When he turned around and looked at the bush, it said that the Lord saw that he had his attention, and then the Lord began to speak to him. Had Moses just said, well, that's strange, and kept walking, then how different would the outcome have been, But God got his attention, and when God got his attention, then Moses responded, and he said, here am I. The same way with Joshua, when he had his holy moment with God, when God got his attention, then Joshua responded with what does my Lord want his servant to do? What is it that God is calling me to do? What is it that I need to step into? And so that should be our hearts going forward, is what is it that I need to step into? What is it that God's calling me to step into this morning, tonight, as the service goes forward throughout the week, as our church goes forward and moves into the things of God? What is God asking me to step into? And that we're reverence to those holy moments of when God speaks. We don't allow anything to distract us or anything to get in our heads, but we listen to that voice and we respond, because it's in those moments that God is asking of us and calling us and prepping us to do something much bigger than what we are. And I tell everybody, I don't know unless the Lord tells me. I don't know what I should preach. I don't know what I should teach. I don't know who I should pray for. I don't even know how I should pray for most people if the Lord doesn't help me know how to pray. You know, there's sometimes people come up to you and they don't say anything. They just need you to pray, you know. Well, I don't know how to pray for them if the Lord doesn't tell me, if the Lord doesn't lead me, you know. And that's with the Holy Spirit begins to work through you and begins to lead you, that you respond to that call in your life. You respond to what God is doing, and then we see that God can operate in us on much greater scales than what we are and of who we are. But it's in those moments, in those holy moments with God, that define us. It's in those holy moments with God that we're building trust with God and He's building trust with us. That's what a relationship is, right? You know, it's the same way with our marriage. You know, you don't just automatically start trusting that person. You know, maybe that's me. I'm a little skeptical of most people to start off with. You know, I don't automatically just trust everybody that comes into my presence. You know, I gotta check the fruit out. I gotta, you know, see about their characteristics and what fruit they may be bearing. You know, like I want to know that they're the real deal, because there's also people that are very deceiving. There's also, you know, sheep that are in wolves' clothing, and if we don't have that discernment of the Holy Spirit to know the difference, then we're in trouble, you know. And I remember Brother Mike Jefferson told me one time, he was talking to me about the Lord's call on my life, and he said, "What gifts are you praying for?" And I said, "Well, any of them the Lord will give me." And he said, "I'll tell you the most important gift you can pray for." And he said, "That's the gift of discernment." He said, because you need to recognize when a wrong spirit walks in that door, or a bad spirit comes into your presence, or a spirit that's just not right, or just not like it should be. He said, you need to recognize it when it gets close. He said, to walk in what God's calling you to walk into, you've got to recognize those spirits. He said, so the best thing you could pray for is, God, give me a spirit of discernment. And I do think I have that. I'm thankful for it. My mom used to tell me that when I was young, I didn't know how to handle it. When I was real young, I could walk into a building, and we'd go into a restaurant or something, and by the time I was probably 7, 8 years old, I could sense if there was a wrong spirit there. And if there was a wrong spirit there, I would start looking around, and I could almost pinpoint who it was. And I could do that now, and the Lord's even intense that to the point that I can, without them saying anything, most of the time as the Lord works through me, Holy Spirit reveals it to me. It's not on my own, but I know what it is that I'm dealing with before they even walk up. You know, I know what that spirit is behind it before they even say a word. You know, and it's those things that it used to scare me when I was little. I just want to leave. Like, I want to get out of the place. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to handle it, you know. And my mom told me, she said, I think the Lord's given you a spirit of discernment at a young age, and that's what it is. She said, but you don't have to be afraid. Just because you sense a bad spirit there, you know, you don't have to want to leave. You don't have to be afraid of it. You just got to learn to walk in it. And so the Lord had trained me to learn to walk in this. You know, I think Isaac's a lot the same way. He's very sensitive to the Spirit of the Lord, but he's also very sensitive to wrong spirits. When we went to Nashville back last year, we decided to drive the kids downtown Nashville, just, you know, down Music Row and, you know, all these places. So we turned and went down where they have like all the honky tonks and stuff like that. And they were just like, whoa, what is all this going on? And Isaac got terrified. I mean, went into crying, and he was like, we've got to leave. Like, let's go, let's just get out here, let's get out here. And I was like, it's okay, bud, we just got to work our way through the traffic, we're going to go. And he was like, no, there's something bad here, let's go. Like, so he very much has that at a young age, you know, like anytime he senses anything like that, he wants to leave, you know. And I told him, I said, I recognize that because I was like that when I was little, you know. I wanted to get out of it. I could sense it. I didn't know where it was at, know what it was going on. Of course, down there's no telling what it was. And so, we have to learn as God is calling us and begins to give us these things. And like I said, they're all created in those holy moments that we have with God that define us, that reshape our lives, that put us on the path that God is calling us to, and that we respond to that we let the Lord, as he's calling us into these greater things that are greater than what we have the ability to know or the ability to do, that we listen to the voice of God and we say, Lord, just teach me. Here am I, send me, teach me, show me, help me to learn how to walk in this. Help me to learn to be who you have called me to be. All right. Well, I'm done good. It's 10:02 and I'm done. Well, thank y'all for letting me teach this morning. Y'all have a blessed morning and y'all are dismissed.